Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in epistemology. This is the first lesson in topic number 2. Topic number 2 will be concerning ourselves with thinking about the sources of knowledge, where we actually derive our knowledge from. Now, ultimately, the sources of knowledge are the foundations from which we are able to acquire information about the world and about ourselves. So, this means that ultimately we are going to be thinking about each of the different major sources of knowledge, thinking about how philosophers have dealt with them and treated their reliability, and then think about some of the concerns and challenges associated with these different sources of knowledge. The first of these is going to be in relation to perception. Now, we already have a series of videos on the philosophy of perception, and I think I probably want to go into them in more detail in future lessons. But ultimately, perception is a central source of knowledge and is one of the most fundamental ways in which we engage in the world around us. Now, it is also important because perception is one of the most philosophically challenging concepts that sort of interacts with both epistemology and the philosophy of mind, and to a lesser extent, a broader understanding of metaphysics. And so, when we think about perception, it is often described as a multi-step process. It is a multi-step process that begins with the reception of stimuli from the environment, and it ends with the interpretation and the integration of that information in our mind. And so when we think about the process of perception, we begin with stimulus reception. So sensory organs, such as your eyes, your ears, your skin, your taste buds, will detect physical stimuli from the environment. So if light waves enter your eye, or if sound waves vibrate your eardrum, this then leads to the conversion of that physical stimuli into electrical signals that are then processed by the brain. This is a process known as transduction. So the light or the sound vibrations then get turned into electrical impulses within the brain. These electrical signals then get transmitted to the brain. They travel from the sensory organs to the brain, where they are interpreted by the brain. This is the really interesting part, and the part that is incredible, which is the perceptual interpretation. The brain processes the sensory data, and they combine it with prior knowledge, prior experiences, and prior contextual information, and this generates a perception of the world. It is at this stage where interpretation, where judgment, where decision making all happens, which ultimately leads to our conscious experiences. The conscious experience of seeing, of hearing, of tasting, of touching. These are all things that are done as the result of perceptual interpretation. Various philosophers have gone down the road of empiricism. So these have all argued that perception is a fundamental source of knowledge. For these philosophers, who I'll get to in a second, perception and sensory experience is the starting point from which all knowledge is derived. And according to this view, the mind begins as a sort of blank slate, as a sort of tabula rasa. And it is only through experience, through perception, that we come to have knowledge of the world. Hence why perception is such an important character for our understanding of knowledge and epistemology. John Locke, for example, distinguishes between primary qualities, such as the shape, the size, and the motion that exists in an object itself, and their secondary qualities, such as their colour, their taste, and their sound, that exist only in the mind of the perceiver. According to John Locke, then, perception allows us to apprehend primary qualities of objects, while it is our sensory experiences of those secondary qualities that are more subjective and more dependent on the observer and the perceiver. A more radical view of perception and empiricism is taken by Berkeley. Now, Berkeley took a more radical view by claiming that objects do not exist independently of perception. His famous dictum, the dictum of esse est percepi is this idea that to be is to be perceived. And what he suggests here is that all reality is in fact mind dependent. For Berkeley, the existence of physical objects is tied to their being perceived by the conscious mind. And you can think of this as the sort of famous philosophical dictum of, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody is there to hear it, does it make a sound? According to Berkeley, the answer is no. According to Berkeley, things don't exist unless they are perceived by a conscious mind. A very, very radical conception of reality and metaphysics. For Hume, you see there is a certain sense of epistemological and empirical skepticism. Hume was highly skeptical of the idea that we can have certain knowledge of the external world and that we can attain that knowledge through perception. He argues that our perceptions, what he called impressions, are all we ever have in terms of our direct experience of reality, that we can never know with certainty whether the external world exists or even whether or not the external world exists as we perceive it to exist. This gives rise to his famous argument, his problem of induction. And the problem of induction questions whether sensory experiences could justify inductive inferences about the future or about unobserved parts of the world. We'll get to that, I believe, either in this lesson or in the next lesson. So one of the major debates around perception is the debate between direct and indirect realism. This is the question of whether or not we perceive the world directly or indirectly. According to direct realism or naive realism, as some describe it, this is the position that perception gives us direct access to the world as it really is. According to this view, then, when we perceive an object, when I perceive this pen that I've got in my hand right now, we are immediately aware of the object itself, not merely of a mental representation of that object. I'm aware of this thing in and of itself. When I look at an everyday tree, I am directly aware of the tree and its properties, not aware of a mental image of the tree that my mind has constructed internally. This is a view that is often associated with a sort of more common sense or everyday understanding and experience of the way in which we perceive the world. It is a view that is often associated with the idea that where objects appear to exist independently of the perceiver and possess characteristics, that means that they are simply seen or simply heard, or simply tasted or simply felt. By contrast then, indirect realism, sometimes known as representationalism, argues that we do not in fact have direct access to the external world or to external objects, but instead we just perceive them indirectly through mental representations, through sense data. According to this view, what we perceive are not in fact objects themselves, but are instead just representations or just images that are formed by the mind, and they are formed by the mind on the basis of sensory input. For instance, when we look at a tree, we perceive a mental representation of that tree. We cannot know the tree itself in its entirety. We can only know what our mind constructs for us as a mental representation of the tree. This view acknowledges that perception is mediated by cognitive and sensory processes, and that our experience of reality could even be subjected to various different distortions and limitations. And this is the first problem. The first problem in relation to naive realism is the idea of perceptual illusion. This is a key challenge for understanding perception as being something that directly contributes to our understanding of the world in a kind of naive realist sense. Essentially, situations in which our senses deceive us can cause us to misinterpret the external world. These illusions raise important questions about the reliability of perception. So, for example, you could have visual or optical illusions, like the Muller-Lyer illusion, where you have two lines that are of equal length that appear to be unequal due to the arrow-like ends. I should really have had an image of it up here, but for those of you who want to see that or haven't seen it already, just Google the Muller-Lyer illusion and you will see an image, and it is two lines that are the same length, but they look like they are different, and it is essentially impossible for you to see that they are the same length because of the ways in which your mind misrepresents and misinterprets the length of those lines. It demonstrates how the mind can be tricked into perceiving something that doesn't correspond to objective reality. There are others. There are the auditory or other sensory illusions. So things like phantom sounds in tinnitus, or those TikToks where you have people who say a word and depending on when you are reading a particular word on screen, it will actually sound as if you are reading the word that you are reading, and all these different kinds of things. You can also have tactile illusions, such as the sensing of feeling a stimuli that isn't present. Often people go through concepts known as pareidolia, which is this idea of feeling things that don't actually exist. There's no stimuli present. A lot of people, for example, how many times have you had your phone in your pocket and you believe that you felt that the phone had vibrated when in fact it didn't? This is a sort of sense of pareidolia. These highlight that perception can be distorted across all of the senses. You also have the fact that there are cognitive influences, such as confirmation bias or selective attention. This also influences our perceptual experiences. Biases shape how we interpret sensory information and will often lead to distorted perceptions of the world. A person, for example, who is fearful of dogs may perceive a harmless dog as more threatening than it actually is because of this confirmation bias, because of this cognitive influence, because of this distortion in terms of fear of that particular cute little fluffy dog. So as we can really see here, perception is obviously an area of philosophy that I have already done a series of videos on, but I'm probably going to do another series of videos on in the future in more detail. And for our purposes, doing epistemology, perception is often considered the foundation of knowledge about the external world. But its reliability is a matter of ongoing philosophical debate. Philosophers ask whether perception provides knowledge in the strict sense or merely the raw data that is required for further processing of knowledge. And so this brings in some of the ideas that we have already explored. In epistemology, the concept of justified true belief is used to try and evaluate whether or not something counts as knowledge. It is sort of our understanding of the ontology of knowledge that we have explored in previous lessons. Now, perception can be a source of justified belief, but whether it leads to knowledge depends on whether the perceptual experience is accurate and properly justified. So if our perceptions are flawed on the basis of an illusion, let's say, then that won't constitute knowledge, because even if we believe it, and even if we are justified in our belief of it because we are seeing this illusion, it is still nevertheless the case that it is not true. If we go back to that case of the sensory illusion, the Muller-Lyer illusion, okay, there are two lines that appear to not be equal in length because of the arrow-like ends. Now, if I was to perceive that, I would see that there are two lines that look like they are different lengths. I would be justified in that belief then that the lines are not equal in length because I can see that they are not equal in length, but this would not count as knowledge because it is in fact the case that this proposition, the belief in that proposition, is false. They were the same length. And so the result of that is that we don't have knowledge on account of the classical tripartite theory of knowledge, the idea of justified true belief. In the context of perception, the debate between internalism and externalism also comes into play, because an externalist will argue that perceptual knowledge can be justified by external factors, so the reliability of sense organs or on the environmental conditions, for example, whereas On the other hand, an internalist will maintain that justification must depend on the individual's internal cognitive access to that evidence. And so when we apply this to the idea of perception, an externalist would say that our perceptual experiences may be justified by factors beyond our immediate awareness, whereas an internalist will emphasize conscious reasoning and reflection in thinking about our perceptual experiences. So, again, this is the debate that one can have. But one could also think about the role of context in our understanding of perception. Perception is not a passive process. It is shaped by a range of contextual factors, including our expectations, our experiences, and our attention to cultural backgrounds. There are famous experiments, for example, where you will have an object such as, let's say, an object that you would ordinarily find in a kitchen, okay? So let's say a breadboard or a bread tin. If you are asked to identify that object when it is in a kitchen, it is really, really easy to find. But if you were to put that object in a different room, a room that has completely got nothing to do with, then it has been found that it is more difficult to identify. Or maybe it's the other way around. In one of those, it is more difficult to identify those objects, and the reason for this, ultimately, it doesn't matter which way around it is. I'll put in the comments down below which one it was. It's been a while since I read this particular thing, but ultimately, the conclusion, the important part, is the conclusion that the context will depend on your ability to perceive things and the sort of veracity of your perception, which is really, really interesting. So, in perceptual theory, there are two processes that are often distinguished that I've cited here on screen. The bottom-up processing system, which begins with sensory inputs and builds to a higher level cognitive processing, versus the bottom-down processing. This involves the use of prior knowledge, expectations, and context, which then goes to interpret the sensory data that is inputted. So, for instance, our expectation of seeing a tree in a forest may influence how we perceive ambiguous shapes in the environment. Again, this is similar to that example that of the experiment that I cited. Maybe the context and the knowledge of our prior knowledge and our prior experience and expectations shapes the ways in which we see things coming in as inputs through our perceptual experiences. Does our knowledge come from a sort of bottom-up processing, where we perceive a thing and we interpret it and we create knowledge as a result, or is it more of a top-down approach, where you have already previously existing processes of understanding and of knowledge and of context, and it is from there that we then you get the input from a sensory experience, and you sort of mingle together these things to result in a conclusion about a particular sighting or a particular hearing of a thing or whatever. A familiar example of the role of context when thinking about perception is sometimes known as the context effect, where the perception of an object can change depending on the surrounding environment or prior experiences. So this is the example that I used earlier about the objects in a kitchen versus not in a kitchen. So the same object might look different, for example, in different lighting conditions, or the perception of a sound might be affected by the background noise. So this is sometimes known as the context effect. There are also potentially cultural differences. Research in cross-cultural psychology has shown that perception can vary across cultures. Western cultures, for example, often focus on individual objects in the visual field, while it has been found that Eastern Asian cultures tend to emphasize more the background context of a particular subject. These differences in perceptual focus are thought to be influenced by cultural practices and social norms, but they lead to, even if it's ever so slight, they lead to distinctions in perception of reality. So these things have to also be interpreted and taken into account when thinking about what reality actually is and trying to understand what reality is. It leads to quite metaphysical and existential questions and problems about reality when you say to people that people's perceptions of the world might change even if it's ever so slightly, but they might change as a result of their culture or their social background. So all of this means that essentially perception remains a controversial source of knowledge in epistemology, but nevertheless quite a critical one. So philosophers have grappled with various different challenges. You have, for example, the problem of perceptual error. How can we be sure that our perceptions are reliable, given that there is the possibility of illusions and distortions? How do we know that the knowledge that we derive from our perception is not just knowledge from an illusion, but actually is knowledge of the external world? You have people like Immanuel Kant, who makes a distinction between the idea of the phenomenal world, the world as we perceive it, and the noumenal world, the world as it exists independently of our perception. This is a challenge that raises questions about whether or not we can actually access the world as it truly is. And then finally, you have the classical argument from illusion, which suggests that because our perception is sometimes mistaken, we cannot fully trust our perception as a reliable source of knowledge. Now, critics of this argument suggest that even though perceptions can be erroneous at times, we can still have knowledge of the world because these illusions are not the norm and can be corrected with further inquiry and context. But how do we know what is and what isn't an illusion is obviously the next question that you may be able to ask. And so ultimately then, when we think about the concept of perception as a source of knowledge, it is of course very important, and it is one of the most direct ways in which we engage with and try to understand the world. And while perception does offer us valuable insight into what is and what isn't knowledge, it is not without its complexities and without its limitations. And so philosophers will continue to explore the relationship between perception and reality, and so too will psychologists and cognitive scientists as well. Now, the next lesson is going to think about a different source of knowledge, the idea of reasoning and rationality as a source of knowledge, and contrast that with the empiricism that we've explored in this lesson through perception.